I've got a really fun vintage airbrush that we're going to look at this week. This is my OLYMPOS MP-200A. Now, it's an older airbrush, of course, but what makes it so special is that it's the original micron. This OLYMPOS airbrush is actually the predecessor to the modern custom micron before Iwata took over the design and the production. So let's start this one a bit different by taking a look at the finish underneath the macro lens, and it's pretty fantastic for an airbrush that's nearly 40 years old, but granted, I baby all my vintage airbrushes. I mainly buy these for my collection, although they do get a fair amount of use in the rotation. I bought this one for around $230 US, although some of these vintage OLYMPOS microns can get very expensive, and I'll talk about that when I cover a few more of the ones that I own in the future. It's a Japanese airbrush, of course, with a very nice build and manufacturing of it, and the nozzle is still in good condition, nicely centered within the nozzle cap. This MP200 is a 0.18 with a micron head system that's very similar to modern custom microns, but it has its differences, which I'm going to go over in a little bit. It has a retro A-style cup on top, which holds about 1 milliliter of fluid, so just a few drops of paint while working with this one, which is something that I like. It's a unique design because a modern A-style airbrush usually has the cup flush with the body like you'll see in this Sotar 2020 Slim. And it's much smaller than a B-style cup like you'll see in this custom Micron B, but it holds a bit more paint than most A models. And what's nice about it is that you still get plenty of room for your trigger finger and a very good line of sight as well. Here's a macro lens shot of what this cup looks like inside. It's a decent finish throughout and it has a flat base, very similar to an Iwata custom Micron B. The rear handle on this airbrush is very light. I believe that it's made out of Bakelite, which was a very popular synthetic plastic used throughout the 20th century. And at the very back, there's also a limiter, and you can use this to preset your trigger throw distance if you'd like. We have a common round trigger pad on this airbrush with a small impression in the center. It's the old standard, it's comfortable while still offering a fair amount of grip. I always found that it's always nice to work with one of these, and it's a smooth trigger with a lot of adjustability for your tension preference. When I remove that rear handle, you're going to see the same design here from a modern custom Micron or a Krios PS771. And you can adjust this screw back a few turns to make that trigger feel extremely light if you like, or you could tighten it down for a heavier trigger with more resistance, and that's what I prefer. That's going to be up to you and your preferences. It's always nice to see a good range like this. You can set it any way you like. Something that I found interesting, and I notice it every single time I pick up this airbrush to start painting with it, is that the trigger in it sits a bit lower than most modern triggers available today. Let me show you an example of what I'm talking about. Here's the OLYMPOS next to my Sotar 2020, and here it is next to an Iwata Custom Micron B. Now, it's not a huge difference by any stretch, but it's actually very noticeable once you start painting with it, and I personally am not a huge fan of shorter airbrush triggers. It just doesn't really fit my preference and painting style. But if you do like a slightly shorter trigger, I bet you'd feel right at home painting with this OLYMPOS micron. It's cool to see. One thing that I learned the hard way about working with this airbrush is that you need to be very careful with this airbrush needle. It's extremely thin and fragile. While I'm painting, I often remove the tip dry using my fingertips, but I learned the hard way on this OLYMPOS model that you need to be extra careful here because this thing is going to bend with a slight amount of pressure. So here's the OLYMPOS next to the Iwata custom micron needle side by side, and although they're both said to be 0.18, the OLYMPOS has a much longer taper and a hair-thin tip at the very end. It is a very nicely made and polished needle, and as long as you're extra careful while painting with this one, you're going to be just fine, but I would definitely recommend having a few spares on hand or a sharpener just in case. And unfortunately, a modern 0.18 needle does not fit this vintage OLYMPOS micron. I did have a bit of success with Harder & Steenbeck's 0.15, which I used one time before getting a replacement. It's not great, but it'll work. Now, before we get into some of the painting tests, I want to do a quick breakdown to show you all the internal parts here and a few of the differences from a modern custom micron. You'll see I have a Harder & Steenbeck quick disconnect at the bottom of this airbrush. It fits it perfectly. The first thing that I'm doing here is removing the rear handle, loosening up the needle chucking nut, and retracting the needle out of the back of the airbrush. In their manual, this part, which is like the housing, is called the needle chuck guide. It's a little tight, so to loosen it up, I'm going to use a pair of soft jaw pliers so that I don't mar any of this chrome. And then once I have that loosened up, I can unscrew it by hand. Now, with the soft jaw pliers, I only use those occasionally to loosen up parts that might be a bit sticky. But for reassembly, I never use any tools. I always do it by hand, just finger tight. So here it is fully disassembled. It's very similar to a modern custom micron or a Krios PS771. It consists of the needle chuck, the needle spring, the spring adjuster, and the needle chuck guide, which houses it all together. And you'll see to reassemble it, I just place the spring over the chuck, I place it into that housing, and I screw in that spring adjuster into the back. And like I mentioned earlier in the video, you use this screw to adjust the tension or the resistance on the trigger. I usually keep it on the tighter side. So once I have that removed, as well as the needle, I can lift the trigger out and I can tip the airbrush over to remove that back lever. And this is what the vintage micron trigger looks like. You'll see that the piston is actually connected to the bottom of it on a small hinge, and this is different from the modern versions. Those are separate. So unfortunately, you're not able to swap in a modern micron trigger into this Olympus micron. It's a very different design. And you'll notice that that trigger lever is a separate piece like you'll see in most vintage airbrushes. Let's move along to the best part of any micron, that's the head system. The first thing I'm removing here is that crown needle cap. And then I can unscrew this nozzle base to remove this entire head system from the airbrush, and you'll see on the back that this particular model has 3 holes in the back, similar to a modern version. I'll unscrew that nozzle cap that exposes the nozzle itself, and you can see that it's that standard 3-part system with the base, the nozzle cap. And here's what it looks like up close. You'll notice that I never remove the nozzle on these. I only swap out the nozzle if I'm certain that there's something really wrong with it, like it's cracked or it's got a flared tip. Otherwise, I just leave it like this. Here's a quick comparison of the nozzle base with the Olympus on the left and the Iwata on the right. And you'll see that they're pretty similar, but there's a few differences, like the 3 holes are a bit larger on the Olympus version. The machining of it is a bit different as well, but the Olympus actually has a few different versions of this nozzle base, like here's a single hole version from my MP-200B. I will say that the different head systems on the Olympus microns do spray very similar to one another. It's hard to really see much of a difference, but I will cover this in a future video, probably next year. Let's move along to the painting test. The first thing I did here was write out the word airbrush on a matchstick just to show you how much detail I can paint with this one. I was able to paint these letters just as small as the letters that you'll see on a dime, and for this I'm spraying it around 15 psi with reduced acrylic ink. It's cyan by Schmincke Aero Colors. One of the keys to this is proximity, and what I mean by that is just being very close to this matchstick that I'm painting, but equally important is that trigger control. I found the control on this one to be fantastic, which of course is what I expect from this brand. It took me a few tries, but I was able to get nice sharp lines here with excellent control of the paint flow, starting and stopping for each one of these letters. I'm painting a few dots here to show you the trigger control, and while it's very good, I do have to pull a little bit farther back on the trigger to initiate the paint flow. It's very consistent, so it's easy to control, but it's not as instant as what I'm used to. It's probably difficult to show on video here, but I'm pulling the trigger a little bit farther back than I normally do to initiate the paint. And for fine lines, this Olympus is great. I can easily paint in hair-thin lines. But I can also do this with most airbrushes. It's easiest with a 0.35 or smaller. Again, it's always about being very close to the surface to get the thinnest part of that cone-shaped spray pattern. I'll do a line consistency test here, just spraying a long continuous line to show you how this airbrush atomizes the paint. One thing that's nice is that it has such a narrow spray pattern that even if I'm spraying a little bit farther back at a distance, I'm still getting a relatively thin line. If I move in closer, like I'm doing in the center here, the line is going to be thinner. Then in the end, I'll back it off a little bit to get a wider spray pattern. I'll spray a few of these dots at a distance so you can see the spray pattern. Very nice soft atomization. You can see the edges just blend out very smooth from the center. For this example, I'm using the same paint and I'm spraying around 23-24 psi. I started this portrait a few days ago. I've been working on it with my Krios PS771 and my Harder and Steenbeck Evolution. It's the new version, the 2024. So I switched over to my Olympus airbrush here to see how it compares, and what I'm doing is just lightly applying some thin glazes of this black paint into some of the shadows to help darken them up. The paint is so light that it's probably even hard to see what I'm doing, but it's just this very thin glaze to slowly darken up a few of these values within the shadows. And for some of these soft, very subtle blends, I think this airbrush is fantastic for that because I don't have to be really close to the surface. I can back up a little bit and I still get a nice tight spray pattern. As I paint in this nostril, I'll speed up some of the video here because I think it's a lot easier to see the paint being applied that way. If it's too slow, it's really hard to see what's going on. If I back up the video to where I was painting in the contour of this nostril, the control was great, but again, I did have to pull a little bit farther back on the trigger to initiate the paint flow. One thing I have to mention too is that the airflow on this airbrush is much higher than modern microns, and when you're up close to the surface, that higher airspeed is very noticeable. You feel a lot more air blowing off the surface. So here's a quick airspeed test to show you what I'm talking about. With the custom Micron B, I'm spraying right around 20 psi. You can see I'm getting an airspeed around 4 meters per second. Then when I switch over to the Olympus MP-200, you could hear it right away how much more air it's using. I get an airspeed around 5.5 meters per second. So it's a fair amount more, and you really feel it when you're painting detail up close. So there you go. That's where I'm going to wrap this one up. That's my take on my Olympus MP-200A. Absolutely love having this airbrush in my collection. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you back here next week.